When it comes to Doge, everywhere I go, people are asking me, can they do that? I'm MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, and I'm sitting here with NYU law professor Noah Rosenblum. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Noah, just by way of introduction, you're an associate professor of law at NYU's law school. You're also a faculty affiliate in the history department. You hold a JD and a PhD in history, and your academic work, this is the part I think is the most interesting, sort of lies at this intersection of three disciplines that I think are critical to understanding Doge: administrative law, constitutional law, and history, and in particular, presidential history and understanding and contextualizing the history of the presidency where it comes to the administrative state. Do I get that right?
That's exactly right. I work on the history of presidential control of government.
So before we start talking about everything Doge, can we just unpack for the people watching this, what does it mean when we talk about the administrative state or administrative law? Those are terms that aren't necessarily familiar to our viewers, and I just want to lay that out there for them before we have this conversation.
Sure. So the administrative state is a way of talking about all the things that government does. If we think about the United States government, the Constitution doesn't say very much about what the government is supposed to look like. But over the course of the last 220 years, many different problems have presented themselves that needed to be solved at the federal level. And in response to each problem, Congress has created different kinds of institutions. Usually these are agencies. And if we think of the sum of all of those agencies together, that makes the government. So the administrative state is just another way of talking about that government, paying attention to each of these different components. And administrative law is the law that governs those different agencies.
Okay. When we talk about Doge, I think one of the things that's not really well understood is that Doge is like the government equivalent, and follow me here for a second, of the late 90s, early 2000s movie Face Off. Do you know this movie? It's like a terrible Nicolas Cage, John Travolta movie where they are exchanging essentially personalities and souls under the face of another. Okay. And I use that analogy because Doge basically went into the shell of an agency that was gutted, the United States Digital Service, which was meant as an advisory agency to assist other federal agencies with their use of the digital space and the internet. And into the U.S. Digital Service, they put Doge, but sort of hollowed it out. So it has the face of the United States Digital Service, or at least like the physical shell of it, but it has been transformed into a wholly different agency. Do I have that right?
Yes. Okay. I love it. You lost me there for a moment, but I think it's exactly right.
I know Nicolas Cage and Doge don't usually go together.
Well, at least Nicolas Cage did some good for the country, as I recall. But
different movie.
You're absolutely right. And part of the reason they did that is because of the underlying legal framework. So most of those agencies are created by statute. So like I was saying before, right, a problem presents itself, Congress passes a law, but there was no law passed to create Doge. And in fact, when President Trump first announced that he was going to do something like this, a lot of us in the administrative law world said, well, nothing to worry about here because he's got to get a law to create a new agency. But instead, they came up with this backdoor way of trying to get it done. The U.S. Digital Service had already existed. I think it might have just been created by executive order. And it wasn't a big deal because, as you just said, it was really this advisory body. It didn't have responsibility for implementing any laws, really. But Trump took advantage of the fact that it's not really supposed to have any power or authority. It's merely advisory, to totally swap out the personnel and put in place a different group of actors who have a very different understanding of what their responsibilities are.
And a different mission. And my understanding is that like it also took it on a second step, right? So first you hollow it out, you put in an entirely new group of people with a different mission. And then in order to skirt some freedom of information laws that would allow the public access to what Doge is doing, then you migrate it and you put it into the Office of Management and Budget or to the White House, I'm not sure which, but sort of put it into the structure of the White House so that it no longer functions as an independent agency. Is that right as well?
Right. So I'm less up on the FOIA law, but I will flag the reason we're also confused about DOJ is because nothing like this has ever happened before. And as you know even better than me, they've gone out of their way to resist answering information, I think in part to make it more difficult, not just to get information from them, but also to sue them in court and hold them accountable under law. But you're exactly right that they've been using DOJ as this vehicle so that the White House and the president in particular can exercise really unprecedented control over how these government agencies are operating.
Elon Musk was on Fox, and basically what he said was there is nothing that DOJ has done that people can't see by going to DOJ's website, that it is effectively the most transparent agency in government history. True or false?
False.
Tell me why.
So many different reasons. So first, let's start with that website. I don't know if you've been to it recently, but they keep restricting the information on it because when they were giving all the information, it turned out that it was riddled with errors. So as a threshold matter, that's a problem for us. Secondly, transparency is really about understanding. You have to be able to see what an agency is doing and grasp what it's up to. And in DOJ's case, we've got the opposite of that. So we don't know what the structure of the agency is. We don't know what its charges are. We don't know what its mission is.
Okay.
We don't know what the laws are that it's supposed to be implementing. And as we're seeing in these court cases, it sure seems like it's up to stuff that, as we learn more, turns out to be either transparently illegal or at the very least in real tension with the spirit of the laws.
Let's go back
that
for a
it's—
second. When you say we don't know what laws it's supposed to be implementing, is it possible there aren't any laws it's supposed to be implementing? In other words, that the mission, as it's been envisioned by the administration, isn't really one about the implementation of statutes, but rather the imposition of the will of this administration on an existing agency framework.
Right, exactly. And in fact, if it were implementing laws, then you would have a whole bunch of other constitutional problems and potentially statutory problems. It seems like DOJ is doing things that affect laws that are on the books, though. So in order to fire people, for example, which
Right.
seems to be something that DOJ is closely connected with,
Yep.
it's got to tap into a whole legal framework. They're kind of trying to have it both ways. They're saying this legal action isn't really coming from DOJ. It's coming from the independent authority of the agency chiefs. But it also seems clear that they're doing it because of DOJ. But just as you're suggesting, DOJ is sort of acting as a vehicle for the president here. And just to be clear, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. So think of the chief of staff to the president, right? That's someone whose job it is to basically transmit the president's will. But in this case, there's a lot of unusual stuff happening that might make us suspicious of the particular way this agency or non-agency or whatever we want to call it is acting as a vector for the president.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the real issue isn't that they are trying to execute on his will. It's that there isn't an appropriate regulatory or statutory framework for doing so.
Exactly right. And we can go deep here. There's a historical issue. So in the past, presidents have sometimes tried to go around Congress and get their own advisors to do whatever they want. That was a fight even going all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. But then there are a whole bunch of legal issues there too. So if you think about the Constitution, the president's responsibility is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Right? There's this subservience of the president to law. And so even if you're advising the president, you still have to follow the law. The last thing here is that the structures that the president used to supervise the government used to be structures Congress was very invested in. Some of the biggest fights in American political and administrative history were about these tools the president would have in order to control the administrative state. And in this case, you see the president going totally around Congress, just creating his own tools to do whatever he wants.
And to be fair to the Trump administration, a total abdication by Congress of their own tools to serve as a check on his going around them. I mean, I think one of the things that's so curious about all the DOJ-specific litigation that we're about to talk about is that Congress is missing in action from all of these fights. Were Congress willing to stand up and be like, wait a second, we create and decreate agencies. Wait a second, we appropriate funds. You don't get to just rescind them. That's what the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 is about, that you can't just take back what we've already appropriated out there. To use another movie reference, like it's when Harry Met Sally, they're like, you can't take it back. It's already out there, right? Like, but that is
Right.
in essence, what Congress should be saying right now if they were appropriately protective of their own constitutional prerogatives.
You're exactly right. And this is a deeper problem with American politics, which is that the vision of the Constitution that we all learned in school is that the three branches are supposed to counterbalance each other and they're supposed to be jealous of their own power. But my colleagues wrote this very famous article called Separation of Parties, Not Powers. What we actually know about American politics is that the separation of powers seems to matter less than the party allegiance across the different branches of government.
Yeah, and never more so than now, right? Okay, so let's talk about some of the challenges to what DOGE is doing. One of the things that I've noticed is that some of those challenges are themselves sort of like side skirting the major issue, because instead of saying what DOGE is doing here is flagrantly unlawful, instead the legal challenges are to the existence of DOGE, and they come in sort of two flavors. One is that DOGE is too powerful to have a head that was not nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. This is the Appointments Clause argument, and very similar to the argument that Trump and his lawyers made to get rid of the Mar-a-Lago documents case by claiming that special counsel Jack Smith was too powerful to not have been nominated by a president, confirmed by the Senate, that it was a violation of the Appointments Clause. Judge Aileen Cannon in Florida went for that argument, and they're bye-bye the Mar-a-Lago documents case. But folks are now making that argument with respect to Elon Musk and DOGE. There's a different argument that's being made that sort of takes a completely opposite view of DOGE, saying, well, if DOGE is what it says it is, if it is an advisory agency, there is a federal statute by which it's supposed to operate. And that federal statute commands those kinds of agencies with making all of their work totally transparent, including by inviting the public in to watch their meetings. And so you've got these sort of twin pillars of challenges to DOGE action by challenging the very existence of DOGE. Talk to me about those and whether you think either of those arguments are likely to prevail.
So the way that I think about this when I teach law is to say that we have to move from our basic, normal human intuitions to the weirdo language of the law. And I think this is a great example.
The weirdo language of the law. You and I speak weirdo.
That's why they pay me lots and lots of money to teach them the weirdo language. This weirdo language, it's really powerful, but it's really narrow and it's totally non-intuitive. So if we think, and the DOGE example you're playing out is a really great example of that gap. So the underlying problems are really easy for us to understand, and I think you just nailed them. Is DOGE too powerful? And if it's really powerful, well, then we should think that the ordinary checks and balances that exist on power in our government would be operating here, like the Appointments Clause. So the Appointments Clause requires that the heads of department, right, the top people in these agencies get appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And we know what that looks like. You've got those hearings and all that. And that's one way of doing a checking and balancing control thing.
Basically, the argument is Elon Musk is as powerful, if not more powerful, than Attorney General Pam Bondi, and therefore the process should be the same and the constitutional checks and balances should be the same for his being able to come into the government and exercise the authority and power that he has.
Exactly right. And that resonates with us as Americans. And just to really hammer that one home, if Elon Musk could have more power than like a Pam Bondi, wouldn't it be weird that we require these lesser people, the most powerful actors in government beside the president, like Pam Bondi or the head of HHS or whatever, to go through confirmation, but not Elon Musk? So that's the intuition.
Right.
The problem, to go back to the weirdo language issue, is that the Constitution doesn't really talk about power. The Constitution talks about officers. And even there it talks about inferior officers and the other officers, sometimes called principal officers, but that's actually from that's not from the Constitution, that's from the Supreme Court. So we're trying to calque our intuitions, which are really about power, onto this archaic language from hundreds of years ago that never
map it on to this whole question about who's an officer and who gets to remove and appoint which officers. And that's part of a larger, just to put this in context for anybody watching, this is part of a larger debate about presidential power that's playing out in other cases right now about people that Trump wants to fire, whether it be line assistants in the Department of Justice. He just fired another one in California who was involved in the investigation of a CEO who has been a major donor to him. Everything from like bottom level prosecutors in the Department of Justice to people who sit on various commissions like the FTC or the Merit Systems Protection Board or the NLRB, where Trump's vision of presidential authority is the president must have total control over who serves in the executive branch, civil service definitions essentially be damned. Right?
Absolutely, you got it. The former Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas quipped back in the 70s, the president is not the government. The president is part of the government, but that's clearly not how Trump understands things.
No.
So if you've got Trump's position that he is the government, then those distinctions between different kinds of officers and the sorts of powers and protections they can have, they just don't matter.
Right.
But obviously for the rest of us who care about the rule of law, that's really important. The problem and the reason it's a little slippery when it comes to DOJ is that the legal test for officers doesn't map in a way that's really useful onto the way DOJ is operating.
Well, particularly when the actual administrator of DOJ is not someone named Elon Musk.
You got it. And then when the kinds of actions that the government is taking in response to DOJ so-called recommendations are being justified by appeal to the particular powers of those agencies, even though you and I both know from reading the news and we're hearing from people inside the government that actually DOJ is driving things. So the reality of the experience and the legal framework for calculating it, for mapping it, don't totally line up.
If you're the Supreme Court and you're just trying to understand, does this person exceed the authority we would expect of someone in their position? Can you sort of call the bluff of those in charge? Can you say the way that they're describing DOJ, the representations they've made, they're pretextual, and therefore this is a violation of the Appointments Clause, or you don't think it's going to turn out that way?
Well, I think that's exactly the question that a court is going to have to get into. We're seeing in the arguments they're making in
I should be a
court.
Supreme Court justice. No, I'm kidding.
You'd have my vote, except of course they're anti-democratic and we don't vote for them. But if I could, I'd put you there.
I appreciate that.
I mean it genuinely. But that's exactly right. They're going to have to delve into the way these agencies are actually operating. The claim DOJ is making in various places is, no, we're just like the chief of staff to the president. We don't have any authority. We're just transmitting the president's desires, and then the other agencies are doing it based on their own legal authority. The counter argument is going to be, what are you talking about? No, you are actually exercising continuing authority in a position that is under the laws of the United States, which means you're acting like an officer. And certainly in other cases, we know that the courts don't take officers' self-descriptions as dispositive.
Right. Okay. Before we move on to some of the other things that DOJ is doing, what do you think about the flip side of that? Like the counter argument that some other organizations are making in their DOJ litigation, where they're like, no, actually, if DOJ is what they say they are, then they're not following the law either. Right? Because they're not letting us in to see what they're doing.
So I think it's a nice legal argument because you're trying to gore DOJ on one of two horns of the dilemma, just as you're suggesting. Either you've got power, but in that case, act like something that's supposed to have power, or you don't. But in that case, like I was saying, we've been having fights about this stuff going all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. So there are laws on the books that you have to follow. I hope that the process as it plays out will give us a chance to actually get into the details, because just as you were suggesting, it's really going to be pretty nitty gritty on exactly what's happening. I will say from the outside
is that second argument, the argument that DOJ is an advisory agency and therefore it should be making its decision-making more transparent. That case is moving along at a much slower pace than some of the others. And that gets into, this argument that my friend Steve Vladeck has made in the New York Times and other places about the Tom and Daisy presidency, and essentially saying that the Trump administration's approach to all of this is casual and it's careless and they are breaking things. And by the time courts require that they be put back together, so much of the damage will have been done. How much do you think, and I know this is a large question, DOJ will be able to accomplish before one or more courts says the way you have gone about this larger enterprise? Like, put aside things that are specific, like access to data or physical access to buildings or taking over of leases. When I'm talking about the larger enterprise of DOJ, which is to walk in and accomplish massive reductions of force, meaning firing lots of federal employees, and or slashing budgets at agencies or collapsing agencies into one another, like we see potentially happening at USAID coming into state, or the ATF and the DEA being folded into the Department of Justice. How much of that larger enterprise do you think DOJ will be able to accomplish before and if a court says stop?
I guess the way that I think about it is that for better or worse, Doge is the embodiment of the will of the current Republican Party, which is deeply hostile to government and anti-administrativist. And so whether a court is ever able to stop Doge strikes me as it's related to the question of how much damage is going to be done, but it seems pretty clear, just as you were suggesting, and as Vladek, as Steve, who I also know he's a buddy, as he was sort of saying, it's Trump, not just Doge.
Right.
And that carelessness, that lack of understanding of what government does, that permeates the whole government. So at least the way that I look at it,
Yep.
even as courts are getting involved to try to stop Doge, the real break here isn't going to be a court saying, hey, what you're doing there is illegal.
Right.
It's going to be the American people recognizing that
It's the midterms, right? In
You
other words,
got it,
it's
yeah.
the midterms, not the courts,
Right.
to the extent that that's what happens in the midterms. But it's the political will of the people pushing back, saying, we've had enough. I need my Social Security office
You got it.
in nearby
And-
county to be open.
Totally. And I wasn't trying to avoid your question. It's just that some of the things they've done are so harmful, it may be impossible to undo already. So we're
Right.
never going to know what the damage was, for example, to medical research as a result of the firings at NIH, or how many people have died as a result of the illegal gutting of USAID. And so it feels kind of, I'm at a loss for words to try to quantify the amount of damage, right? Because already in some ways the amount of damage is simply incalculable.
Yep.
And there's no way to undo it. Those are actual lives lost.
But like, talk to me like I'm one of your students, okay?
Okay.
If I were
Sorry.
sitting in one of your lectures
We'll
and
pull
I
it
raised my
together.
hand
Yes.
and said, Professor Rosenblum, what are the top 5 things that Doge has done so far that you could point to and say, this will have reverberations for decades to come, even if we can't fully appreciate and understand them now?
Great.
What are the things that like stand out to you as, oh my God, I can't believe this has happened?
So as a legal historian, the first thing above all others is the precedent that they're setting. So until now, at every moment in American history, if you wanted to try to do what they're doing, you had to negotiate with Congress, you had to bring in stakeholders. You couldn't just be like, well, I'm the president, so now I'm going to do it. But from now on, any president who comes in is going to feel empowered to say, wait, let me just develop alternative processes to seize control of government. And I know it's maybe illegal or at the very least contestable, but screw it. Why don't
Can I
we
pause
chance
you there
it?
for a second? How much do you think that is attributable to the presidential immunity decision that the court rendered last summer? In other words, I have said in other places that I think that the emboldened nature of today's Republican Party, and in particular, the people who form Trump's inner circle, because they understand that he can never be prosecuted for most of what he does in office, that has set up a sort of ring of invulnerability around him that has created the conditions for what we're watching now. Do you think about it in those terms?
So I like your argument a lot as it applies to the advisors, because you and I know that lawyers tend to be pretty risk averse and they will want a decision. So I bet for them the answer is yes. But look, we were both here for Trump's first term. Even then he was saying, I have an Article 2 and I can do what I want. So I don't think the immunity decision did much for DJT in particular.
I have an Article 2 as if it's like I have a Diet Coke.
Totally. And look, as I love to teach my students, read Article 2. We should all read Article 2. The Article 2 powers of the president are quite limited. He gets this thing called the executive power, which isn't defined anywhere. And then he has a duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. But what we learned in school is still true, right? Congress has the power of the purse, not the president.
Okay, so let's go back to my original question because I don't want to let you off the hook so easily. Okay, if the precedent is the first thing
Yes.
that makes you think, like the precedent itself is
Right.
the number one most dangerous thing.
That's right.
What, from a policy perspective, would you point to if we were sitting in your office hours right now and I said, Professor Rosenblum, what are the worst things that have happened as a result of the existence of Doge to date?
So I'm really not a policy expert, except on thinking about the structure of the administrative state. So the
Okay.
one that jumps out at me right away is just as you were suggesting, the collapsing of agencies.
Okay.
So let's think about the dismantling of USAID.
Yep.
It seems like Doge dismantled USAID in all but name. Elon Musk bragged about feeding USAID to the wood chipper.
Right.
Seems pretty clear that the public presentation is Doge, not Marco Rubio,
Right.
decided to destroy this agency. And even though there's still, 15 people allegedly employed at USAID under the explicit statutory command,
Correct.
the goal was through a presidential decree implemented by Doge to destroy a statutorily created agency. Now, that's an unbelievably disastrous thing from a policy perspective, not just because of what USAID actually does, which, like, we can fight about it. Growing up, I was always taught they were a front for the CIA anyway. I know they do a lot more than that, but it's sort of funny from that perspective to think about these guys who are so obsessed with American empire to make their first act weakening American power globally. But that's for my colleagues who really do foreign policy stuff. But if you're thinking about this from a rule of law administrative state perspective, you're now taking apart a statutory agency through a presidential command to someone who, by their own assertion, is not an officer and has no power. So that seems pretty screwy to me.
Well, let's go back for a second. Let me push back on that for a second, right? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that what they are doing is collapsing USAID as a separate agency, but folding all of its function into state and not getting rid of appropriations, but simply like absorbing all of it. What's the danger in that?
Well, first, it's still illegal, right? Because Congress doesn't actually give them the power to do it. Second, if we think about how the Constitution apportions the powers of government, the way government gets built out is according to law. And that's precisely so that government follows the law. If the president can just reshuffle the structure of government because he wants to or thinks so, that will transform how government operates and what its priorities are. And yet the priorities of government are set by statute, right? Personnel is policy, and an org structure is a way of exercising power. So the basic question still is, do we have a republic in which the structure of power is determined according to law, or does the president become the government? In which case, all the rest is secondary. The only thing that matters is who you vote for in the presidential election. And then you've got law insofar as the election is according to law, but basically everything else is after the fact.
Okay, I'm going to let you off the hook with respect to 3, 4, and 5 because I want to move on to something else. We now know, thanks to public reporting, that Elon Musk is due to leave the government sometime soon-ish. That's a conversation that Trump has had with some of his senior advisors, and it's been confirmed by public reporting. The question I have for you is, going back to your point about sort of like, if Doge gets stopped, there's a hostility endemic in the Trump administration and its allies to the apparatuses of government that will continue on. To that point, if Elon Musk leaves government, how effective or ineffective is that?
I think that Musk has become a kind of galvanizing figure in ways that are good and bad for the current political moment. It seems like Donald Trump likes to be able to blame someone else.
Human heat shield?
You got it, if things go wrong. And so to that extent, so much of what Doge has done is unbelievably controversial. I mean, I'm sure you've been watching those town halls like me where you see voters trying to get at their representatives and ask them, why are you standing for this? So in some ways,
some of those town halls aren't happening anymore, right? Because Republican members of the House understand how deeply badly they have gone when they have to stand up, even in like Trump plus 20, Trump plus 30 districts, when people are upset about the delivery of government services and the evaporation of benefits that they count on. It doesn't matter how Trumpy they are, that's still going to really upset them.
Exactly right. This sort of bogeyman of government is a lot harder to maintain when you're talking about the actual government and the people you know working for you. So I think in some ways getting rid of Musk might help Trump solve a political problem for himself. But the underlying hostility, it does seem to me like that's likely to endure. And the vision that Musk is the champion for right now does seem to be more widespread in circles that have a lot of influence with Donald Trump. So you can look at Project 2025, which was not Musk inspired, but the writers of that are now the staffers in the government, right? Russell Vought over at OMB is one of the key architects. And they talk about how they want to traumatize federal employees. And if we think more broadly about the tech sector in American society, I really don't understand how they see the world because, you know, we remember the Silicon Valley Bank disaster where they were running to government, to the administrative state to save them. And yet now they've turned so quickly against the very structures of administration that have literally saved capitalism, both at the time of the New Deal and more recently with SVB. But those tendencies seem to remain. So my own personal sense is that if Musk leaves the government, it may mark the end of a first chapter in this perversion of the rule of law, but there's no reason to think it's the end of it.
It's like Bannonism without Bannon.
Ooh, I like that.
I want to talk about, you mentioned the tech sector for a second. I mean, Doge is so reliant on people that Elon has met or employed through the tech sector that I would be derelict if we didn't talk about Doge's focus on accessing data and systems as a way of accomplishing its larger objectives. And in certain places,
Yes.
we've seen courts being willing to enter emergency orders, whether they're temporary restraining orders or preliminary injunctions, saying, the Doge designees at this agency may not access this type of data. We've seen that at the Treasury Department, at the Office of Personnel Management, at the Department of Education, at the Social Security Agency, in different ways and to different amounts. And then there are other judges who have found that the plaintiffs before them cannot prove that that damage is imminent, that there will be any invasion of Americans' privacy rights through Doge's coming into an agency and trying to access data at, let's say, the Department of Labor. What do we know about Doge's access to data? That's something that I know has been a particular focus for you in terms of the perniciousness of that access to data and what can be done with it. And how would you explain that to people who might be watching and aren't really focused on the data access issue as what's most objectionable about Doge?
So I love this question because it gets at some of the ways in which government is transforming.
Yep.
So when we talk about the administrative state, most of us are thinking about service provision or regulation, but it's easy to forget that the government is a massive processor of data. And here I just have to give credit. There's an incredible scholar at the University of Chicago. Her name is Bridget Fahey. She's working on this right now and has written incredible stuff on thinking about the administration of data. And I've learned a ton from her work. And part of what we now know is that if you are able to control those data flows or even just learn from them, you can wield incredible power in ways that don't necessarily map onto the traditional understanding of government authority. And it seems like the Doge approach at a lot of these agencies has been to seize on what Bridget has called data power and use it to their advantage, both personally, right? Although I suppose we don't know that for a fact, so we should wait to see. But there's a lot of speculation that they're trying to get access to this data for their own endeavors. And we do know, looking at other aspects of government, that private corporations try to take advantage of government transparency processes to get access to this incredibly rich and useful data for their own enterprises. And given how irresponsible the Trump administration has been about separating public and private and conflicts of interest, I think folks are right to be worried about this. For the same
You're
reason.
referencing Signalgate, for example?
For example, right. I don't have tremendous confidence in the ability to maintain integrity if the principals are using commercially available software to plan secret missions. So that's an anxiety. But because of the power of data and because of Americans' deep-seated concern about government getting access to information and using it in ways we don't want, there's a whole legal regime to govern that data. And so to go back to those cases you were identifying, the considerations we were first talking about the structure of government, those are fundamental. Those are about the Constitution and our intuition. But once we start talking about sensitive data, there are a ton of specific statutes that actually govern what you can and can't do. And part of the reason those cases have been, I don't know, more successful, but at the very least have had some success, is because it seems like the same contempt for the rule of law the administration has had in general is especially applied to those statutes. As these guys just go in.
Because there's plain language saying, in some cases, who is allowed to have access to certain payment management systems at Treasury, for example, or data in the Social Security Agency. And that language is not really capable of being interpreted in ambiguous or contestable ways,
You got
right?
it. I'm thinking Pirates of the Caribbean. It's rules, not standards, right? Or guidelines, standards, not guidelines. Is that the line?
I have
Right,
no
these are,
idea. That's a trilogy I don't know.
So it's just super clear, just like what you're saying, right? You're either you can do it or you can't do it. And I think we've had a lot of heroic public servants who, when they realized that they were being asked to break the law, first they stood up and then they resigned or were fired, which is honestly, it's people who decide to take these jobs in government and make less money than they could for their skills. The fact that they've so deeply internalized the rule of law that they are willing to sacrifice their jobs up to uphold the rule of law, that actually I find really inspiring.
Well, sacrifice to a point. I mean, and I'm not faulting any of them, but you and I were talking before we started taping about the fact that Doge has shown up at a variety of agencies, including some really unknown segments of the federal government, like the U.S. African Development Foundation, the U.S. Institute for Peace, the U.S. Institute for Library and Museum Studies. with federal law enforcement accompanying DOJ designees to those agencies. And in some cases, people who have been willing to say previously, no, you may not enter this building, including you may not enter a building that is separately owned by an endowment of the U.S. Institute for Peace, which is an independent agency. But then they show up with federal law enforcement and they either convince security that they are, for example, with the FBI or the U.S. Marshal Service, or they may actually be with the FBI or the U.S. Marshal Service. Can you describe for me your reaction upon learning that DOJ was partnering with agencies that are typically under the control of the Department of Justice and specifically the Attorney General in order to gain physical access to agencies?
I mean, so there's like a happy story and a sad story here. So let's start with the sad story, which is if you've got the men with guns on your side, it's very, very hard to stand up to them.
Yeah.
And I think our civil servants are unbelievable.
And by the way, even civil libertarians, like the ACLU has a guide to what happens when someone, for example, does an immigration raid. What should you do? What should your behavior be like? And all of their instructions say to people, do not resist people who are armed.
Totally.
Right?
And let's be clear, our civil servants care a ton about the government, but that didn't mean that they were going to get themselves shot by the U.S. Marshals for upholding the rule of law. That would be a lot to ask of anyone. So that's the sad story. The happy story here, I'm dispositionally an optimist.
Okay.
If what they were doing at DOJ was so clearly okay, they wouldn't have to get men with guns to force their way into federal buildings.
Of course not.
So there's enough of a residual commitment to the rule of law throughout the government and an understanding that this is so not normal and not okay that the only way they're able to implement this regime is by unbelievable appeal to state violence.
Yeah, that's one of the things that kind of sticks with me. I want to play a Can They Do That lightning round with you for a second.
Oh, let me ready myself.
Okay. I'm going to get my notes for the Can They Do That lightning round.
All right.
Okay.
As long as this doesn't turn up in my tenure file, I'll be okay.
I don't think it will. Trump issued an executive order earlier this term that would essentially put about 1 million civil servants outside the reach of labor unions who represent them. These are labor unions that represent federal employees. Many of those unions are the plaintiffs or among the plaintiffs and lots of DOJ challenging litigation. Can he do that?
No.
Tell me why.
I have to shout out my two favorites on federal employment law, Nick Bednar at the University of Minnesota and Nick Handler, the two Nicholases at Texas A&M. Basically, the law that enables the president, as I understand it from reading their brilliant work, that allows the president to exempt people from collective bargaining is actually really narrowly targeted. So there's a real statutory regime, and Trump just seems to be ignoring it.
We talked about Elon as a special government employee. When he was interviewed, he said that he didn't directly answer a question about what he will do at the expiration of the 130-day mark that legally marks the end of the tenure of anyone who is functioning as a special government employee. We know that Trump has said he will finish his job up soon. But let's assume that Elon stays beyond that 130-day mark. Anybody have standing to contest that, and can he do that?
So can he do it? The standard answer should be no. But then again, remember, they weren't supposed to be able to delay the implementation of the TikTok ban either. That's just blatantly illegal, but they've done it. So I think being legal realists, we probably have to say yes. Does anyone have standing to contest it? I have to think more about that question. That's a nice, hard Fed courts question. My intuition is that you'd have to find someone who could somehow trace harm directly, but I actually don't know enough about the special legal regime there. If I can keep shouting out brilliant people, Anne Joseph O'Connell at Stanford Law School, she's the queen at whose feet we all worship when it comes to these sorts of matters. So if I could phone a friend, I would give her a ring and ask.
Okay, next one. Enforcing the resign or be fired deals, which is what I call, and a better mind than mine, Rachel Maddow, calls the fork in the road directive, and then the newest iteration of them that have been coming down lately, because we are seeing lots of agencies sort of renew this call to, you can resign and get a payout, or you can stay and take the risk. There was a TRO against that fork in the road directive, but it was dissolved, which paved the way for them to go unchallenged. So then here's my question. If the federal government at the end of this refuses to pay up, are these deals enforceable? Can they do that, meaning escape responsibility entirely?
Man, I know you want a quick answer, but I would need to look more at the specific details. Certainly, there's a lot about the deals as I saw them covered
Yeah.
that seems very sketchy and possibly against existing statutory law, which means that the deals were never viable deals in the first place, which means if you tried to enforce them, you'd have a really hard time with that.
Okay. At least one judge has ordered expedited discovery into Doge's access to data at the Office of Personnel Management. There are other judges who have offered that with respect to other agencies. How soon do you think we'll see some of that discovery? And what do you think we'll learn?
um, Given that this administration seems, like I said, pretty contemptuous of the rule of law, I will be surprised if we actually get useful discovery because I bet they're just going to try to stonewall as much as they can. I suspect that we'll learn an awful lot about who's actually running things at Doge and what Doge's relationship is with the rest of the government, which, if we could ever get our hands on that, that would be some really juicy stuff.
Okay, two more questions. One, does a Doge related case reach the Supreme Court sometime in the next 6 months?
Yes.
And does Elon Musk ever have to sit for a deposition in a Doge related case?
No.
Okay. Noah Rosenblum, thank you for joining me on Can They Do That?
Lisa, thank you. This was such a pleasure.